"We are engaged for the next 2 hours," Lady Cecily Norwood whispered to the Duke she had never met.
We are engaged for the next
She
2
did not
hours.
wait for his answer. She simply slipped her trembling hand over his beneath the dinner table. Because the man walking toward her had already destroyed 6 months of her life, and if he found her sitting alone tonight, he would destroy what little dignity she still had left. Across the room, Lord Edmund Carlisle had already seen her. He smiled. The same smile he had worn while convincing all of London that she was the unstable woman who had ruined him, when it was he who had betrayed her. In another 10 seconds, he would reach her table. In another 10 seconds, every guest would be watching. If the Duke rejected her desperate lie, she would become the evening's entertainment. If he accepted it, they would both be trapped inside an engagement that had never happened. For one suspended heartbeat, the Duke said nothing. He looked from her frightened face to the gentleman approaching, then quietly turned his hand beneath hers and intertwined their fingers. When Lord Edmund reached the table, the Duke smiled as though nothing in the world had surprised him. Then, loud enough for the entire room to hear, he said, "My dear, you've kept your fiancé waiting. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more exciting updates. Now let's continue the story. My dear, you've kept your fiancé waiting." The word settled over the long dining table more effectively than if the Duke had struck the silver with a spoon. Conversations faltered. Heads turned one after another. The Duchess of Blackthorn, seated at the opposite end beneath the glittering chandeliers, looked first at Duke Julian Arden, then at Lady Cecily Norwood, and her face brightened with delighted surprise. A secret engagement, hidden beneath the very noses of London society. Within seconds, the whisper began its inevitable journey from guest to guest until even those too far away to hear the Duke's voice were smiling toward them with open curiosity. Across the room, Lord Edmund Carlisle stopped where he stood. The practiced confidence he had carried towards Cecily vanished so quickly that only someone watching closely would have noticed. His hand tightened around the stem of his wineglass. He had expected to find her alone, forced to endure another evening beneath the weight of the story he had built around her. Instead, she sat beside the most sought-after gentleman in England, their hands hidden beneath the table, the Duke himself speaking as though they had belonged together for months. Cecily scarcely remembered how to breathe. She had expected disbelief. At best she had hoped for polite confusion before quietly retreating from the room. She had never imagined that Julian Arden would answer her impossible request without demanding a single explanation. Beneath the table, his fingers remained calmly entwined with hers, steady enough to disguise the tremor running through her own hand. Without moving his smile, he spoke quietly enough that only she could hear. "If you continue looking as though you expect me to expose you, Lady Cecily, everyone else will begin expecting the same." She turned toward him, startled. His expression remained composed, almost indifferent, as though discussing the weather rather than participating in the most reckless deception either of them had ever attempted. "Smile," he murmured. "Engaged ladies are not usually preparing for execution." Despite everything, the absurdity of the remark almost drew a laugh from her. Almost. She managed something that resembled a smile just as the Duchess herself rose slightly from her chair and called warmly down the table. "Your Grace, I had begun wondering whether England's most determined bachelor intended to disappoint us forever. Lady Cecily, you have clearly succeeded where every ambitious mother has failed." Gentle laughter rippled through the room. Every eye remained fixed upon them, waiting for confirmation. Julian inclined his head with effortless dignity. "Her ladyship has always possessed remarkable powers of persuasion." The answer was careful. Neither a direct confirmation nor a denial. Yet no one wished to doubt what they so desperately wished to believe. By the time servants began presenting the first course, the engagement had already become accepted fact. Cecily lowered her gaze to her untouched plate, trying to quiet the frantic beating of her heart. 6 months earlier, rooms like this had welcomed her with genuine warmth. Invitations had arrived almost daily. Ladies had praised her wit. Gentlemen had sought her attention. Mothers had quietly wondered whether she might become their daughter by marriage. Then Lord Edmund Carlisle had rewritten her life before she could gather the strength to defend herself. According to every drawing room in London, she had encouraged his affections until he finally offered for her, only to reject him without reason in a fit of vanity and temper. The abandoned gentleman had earned endless sympathy. The irrational woman had earned polite exclusion. The truth had disappeared beneath repetition. Edmund had discovered that Cecily's inheritance would pass fully into her control upon her 25th birthday. He had spoken of affection while quietly pursuing another heiress whose fortune exceeded even hers. Cecily had discovered his deception by accident, ended the courtship immediately, and expected the matter to remain private. Instead, Edmund hurried ahead of her, presenting himself as the victim before she had even recovered from the betrayal. She could have answered him. She possessed letters. She knew names, dates, conversations. Yet every word she spoke against Edmund would inevitably reach his younger brother, Charles Carlisle. Charles, who had fallen quietly and sincerely in love with Cecily's younger sister Lydia. Their understanding remained unofficial, delicate enough that even a family quarrel might destroy it. Lydia had known happiness so rarely after years spent caring for their widowed mother that Cecily could not bear becoming the reason it disappeared. So she had accepted the whispers. Accepted invitations quietly withdrawn. Accepted ladies lowering their voices as she entered rooms. Accepted gentlemen treating her as though heartbreak had made her unpredictable. She had carried the burden because Lydia deserved a future untouched by scandal. Now, seated beside the Duke, Cecily suddenly realized how exhausted she had become from carrying it alone. Julian noticed before she spoke a word. "You have disappeared again," he observed softly while another conversation rose around them. She looked at him in confusion. "Only in your thoughts," he clarified. "Whatever frightened you enough to invent an engagement has frightened you a great many times before." She hesitated. They were strangers. They should have remained strangers. Yet there was something unexpectedly easy about speaking to a man who had already accepted her greatest folly without ridicule. "Lord Edmund Carlisle," she said quietly, careful not to lift her eyes toward the opposite side of the table. "He believes I wronged him." Julian's gaze drifted across the room until it rested briefly upon Edmund. "No," he replied after a thoughtful pause. "He believes everyone else believes you wronged him. That is rather different." The distinction struck her more sharply than she expected. He had understood something in a single sentence that half of London had ignored for months. The courses changed one after another, and with each arrival came another question from curious guests determined to uncover the romance no one had suspected. Lady Ashcombe leaned forward with delighted enthusiasm. "Lady Cecily, however did you manage to conceal a duke?" A gentleman farther down the table laughed. "More importantly, how did His Grace conceal himself?" The questions multiplied before Cecily could form an answer. Where had they met? How long had they known one another? Why had no announcement been made? Julian never appeared hurried. He answered the first inquiry with perfect calm. "I discovered quite early that Lady Cecily preferred conversations to public spectacles." Several guests nodded approvingly. It sounded exactly like something the reserved Duke might say. Another lady smiled knowingly. Then the courtship must have been wonderfully private. Julian glanced towards Cecily with the faintest suggestion of amusement. "Private enough that even I occasionally questioned whether it was happening." Soft laughter spread around the table. Cecily realized he was leaving careful spaces for her to enter the conversation without trapping her inside unnecessary details. She gathered her courage. His Grace has always possessed an unfortunate habit of believing that silence answers every question. Julian looked at her with convincing affection. Only because your silence has generally been kinder than other people's speeches. The exchange felt so natural that several guests smiled openly at one another. The Duchess herself declared they already sounded like an old married couple. Beneath the table, Cecily's hand relaxed for the first time since entering the house. Then came the voice she had dreaded. Edmund lifted his glass and smiled pleasantly enough that only Cecily recognized the challenge hidden beneath it. "Forgive my curiosity, Your Grace, but London prides itself upon discovering every whisper before breakfast. How remarkable that none of us observed such a distinguished courtship." Every conversation slowed again. Julian regarded him with perfect composure. "That is because London usually mistakes noise for observation." A few gentlemen chuckled into their wine. Edmund's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Then perhaps we have all been inattentive." "It happens," Julian replied mildly. "Especially when people become overly interested in stories that flatter their expectations." The answer sounded harmless. Yet Edmund understood precisely what lay beneath it. For the first time since entering the room, someone had challenged his control of the conversation without accusing him directly. Cecily dared a brief glance toward Edmund and found him studying Julian with unmistakable caution. He had expected an embarrassed stranger. Instead, he had encountered a duke entirely comfortable standing between them. The evening might still have collapsed had Julian demanded an explanation then and there. Instead, he waited until servants removed the final dinner plates and conversation drifted toward music and dancing. Only when those nearest them became occupied did he speak quietly once more. "Now," he said, "I believe my fiancé owes me the beginning of the truth." Cecily closed her eyes for the briefest moment. "Only the beginning. The remainder can wait until fewer people are attempting to overhear us." She looked at him properly then, seeing not merely the title that intimidated half the kingdom but the unusual patience behind it. "You should know," she whispered, "that I involved you in this without permission." "You did. Your reputation may suffer because of me." "It may." "And yet you agreed." Julian rested one hand lightly upon the tablecloth, his voice as calm as it had been from the first impossible moment. "I agreed because frightened people rarely invent elaborate schemes. They reach for the nearest door they believe might still open." His eyes met hers with quiet certainty. "You did not sit beside me because you wished to deceive society, Lady Cecily. You sat beside me because you believed you had nowhere else to go." Before she could answer, the Duchess announced that the ladies and gentlemen would shortly retire to the drawing-room, where the newly revealed engagement would no doubt become the evening's principal delight. Excited conversations immediately broke out around them. Servants began clearing the table. More than one guest approached to offer congratulations. Edmund remained where he was, watching in troubled silence as every smile meant for him over the past 6 months slowly shifted toward the woman he had worked so carefully to isolate. Cecily realized, with equal parts relief and alarm, that the lie was no longer surviving because of her desperation. It was surviving because Duke Julian Arden had chosen to carry it beside her. And for reasons she still could not understand, he had no intention of letting her face the next hour alone. The social interrogation began before Cecily and Julian had taken 3 steps from the dining table. Lady Ashcombe reached them first, smiling with the bright determination of a woman who considered private happiness a personal insult. "Where did you meet?" she demanded. "How long has this been concealed? And why was I not told?" 2 other ladies gathered behind her, while a gentleman near the fireplace openly abandoned his conversation to listen. Cecily felt the old panic return. A lie spoken once in desperation was one thing. A courtship required months, places, witnesses, details. One careless answer would destroy them both. Julian seemed to feel the tension pass through her arm. He placed her hand more securely upon his sleeve and answered without hesitation. "We met at Lady Harbury's winter musicale." Cecily looked at him. Lady Harbury had indeed held a musical in January. Half the room had attended. It was a clever choice because no one could possibly remember every introduction made that evening. "You hated that musical," Lord Westcott remarked from nearby. "You left before the final performance." "I left because Lady Cecily had already gone," Julian replied. The room responded with delighted laughter. Cecily nearly stared at him in disbelief, but he gave the smallest pressure beneath her fingers, reminding her to play her part. Lady Ashcombe turned to her. "And what did His Grace say when you first met?" Cecily understood the trap immediately. If she hesitated, they would notice. She allowed herself one glance at Julian's unreadable face, then said, "Very little." More laughter. Julian looked offended with such restraint that the effect was perfect. Cecily continued, "He asked whether I enjoyed the music. I said I did. Then he stood beside me in silence for several minutes, apparently believing the courtship had begun. It had," Julian said. "I was making excellent progress. You had not yet learned my name. That was a difficulty, not a defeat." The guests laughed again, and something inside Cecily loosened. Their invented history had found a rhythm. Julian offered the foundation. Cecily added the warmth. He protected her from impossible questions without making her appear helpless, and she discovered that she could strengthen the deception rather than merely hide inside it. When Lady Ashcombe demanded to know how long he had courted her, Julian answered, "Since January." When asked why there had been no announcement, Cecily said, "Because His Grace wished to be certain." Julian glanced at her. Lady Cecily wished to be certain. "You required no certainty," she asked. "Only encouragement." "And did you receive it?" Lady Ashcombe pressed. Cecily smiled with growing confidence. "Not nearly as quickly as he now implies." That answer travelled through the drawing-room in a wave of approving murmurs. The Duke had courted her quietly. She had not thrown herself at him. The story gave Cecily dignity, and Julian had built it that way deliberately. Edmund, standing near the mantel, watched every reaction. His expression remained composed, but the glass in his hand had not moved for several minutes. He had spent 6 months teaching London to see Cecily as desperate, rejected, and unstable. Now the same people were watching her tease a duke who appeared entirely content to be teased. The contradiction was becoming dangerous to him. So he stepped closer and entered the conversation with false ease. "January," he repeated. "How fortunate." Lady Cecily was not known for attending many musicales after Christmas. Cecily felt the challenge beneath the remark. Edmund remembered exactly where she had gone because he had still been pretending to court her then. Julian answered before she could. "She attended enough." Edmund smiled. Yet Lady Harbury's house was exceptionally crowded. "It seems remarkable that no one noticed your interest." "You did not notice," Julian replied. "That is not quite the same thing." A brief silence followed. Several guests looked down to hide their amusement. Edmund's face changed for only an instant. Cecily saw it because she had once studied every expression he wore and mistaken calculation for charm. Julian saw it because he appeared to miss very little. Then Cecily added, "His Grace was extremely discreet." Julian turned toward her. "I stood beside you for 20 minutes. Without saying anything memorable. I asked about the music. You asked whether it had ended. I was nervous." This time even Cecily laughed. It escaped before she could stop it, soft but genuine, and the sound altered something between them. Julian's eyes warmed. The guests noticed. Edmund did too. The questions continued through the next quarter hour, but they no longer felt like weapons. Cecily and Julian invented a courtship one answer at a time. They had met in January. He had seen her again at a museum exhibition. She had refused to walk with him because he had arrived without warning. He claimed she had deliberately left him standing beside a Roman statue for 40 minutes. She insisted it had been 20. When someone asked where he had proposed, Julian said, "In a library." Cecily immediately answered, because he believed books would prevent interruption. They did not, Julian said. A footman entered with coal. "And you stopped speaking entirely. A proposal deserves privacy. You had only managed 3 words. They were important words. One of them was my name. The most important of the 3. Their audience adored it. The invented details sounded convincing precisely because they were imperfect. There was no sweeping moonlit declaration, no rehearsed tale designed to impress. There were awkward silences, missed opportunities, and small disagreements that made the courtship feel lived rather than fabricated. Cecily began recognizing Julian's signals. When he lifted one eyebrow, he was giving her permission to contradict him. When his thumb moved once against her gloved hand, a dangerous question was coming. When he became especially formal, he was warning her that Edmund was listening. She responded with signals of her own. A slight tilt of her head meant he was inventing too much. A pressure against his sleeve meant she knew the answer. A pause before smiling warned him that the next question touched something real. The performance drew them closer without either intending it. Their shoulders turned naturally toward one another. Julian brought her a glass of water before she asked. Cecily straightened the edge of his cuff after Lady Ashcombe declared that engaged women were permitted such liberties. Each small gesture made the room more certain. Each small gesture made Cecily less certain where the act ended. Edmund waited until the crowd shifted toward the pianoforte before trying again. "You mentioned a museum exhibition," he said. "Which one?" Julian answered calmly. "The collection at Montrose House." Edmund's eye sharpened. "In February?" "Yes." "Curious." Lady Cecily was in the country for much of February. Cecily knew what he was doing. He was not exposing the lie directly. He was placing doubt into the room one careful question at a time. For 6 months, that method had worked perfectly. He would suggest. Others would repeat. By morning, suspicion would become fact. Julian looked toward her, leaving the answer in her hands. It was the first time he had done so before the room. Cecily understood that he was not testing her. He was trusting her. "I returned to London on the 12th, she said. The exhibition opened to invited guests on the 14th. His Grace arrived late, criticized every portrait, and spent most of the evening pretending not to follow me from room to room." Julian's mouth almost curved. "I criticized 2 portraits. You called one of them a decorative threat." "It was." Lord Westcott laughed. "That sounds exactly like Arden." The danger passed. More than passed. Cecily had supplied a date, a place, and a private remark so specific that Edmund's question now made him appear intrusive. He could not challenge her without admitting how closely he had tracked her movements after claiming she had cruelly rejected him. He stepped back. Julian leaned closer and said under the noise of the music, "Decorative threat. You required something memorable. And you chose an insult I would genuinely use. I am learning your character. After less than an hour. You have made it remarkably easy. That is not a compliment." It was not intended as one. Yet they were both smiling. When the attention of the room finally moved toward a young lady beginning a song at the pianoforte, Julian guided Cecily to a quieter place near the tall windows. They remained visible enough to preserve the engagement, but the music gave them privacy. For the first time since she had sat beside him, there were no immediate questions to answer. Julian looked at her without amusement. "Tell me about Carlisle." Cecily's instinct was to retreat. She had spent 6 months refusing that invitation from everyone who offered it, even those who might have believed her. But Julian had already placed his name beside hers without knowing whether she deserved it. He had defended her in a room where defending her carried a cost. She owed him more than another evasion. "He courted me for my inheritance," she said. The words felt startlingly blunt after so much silence. "It passes fully into my control when I turn 25. Edmund discovered the amount before I knew he had asked." Julian did not interrupt. "He spoke of marriage," Cecily continued, while pursuing another heiress. "Her fortune was larger. I learned of it and ended the courtship. He reached society before I did. By the following week, I had become the woman who encouraged him, demanded an offer, then rejected him in some fit of wounded pride." Julian's expression hardened, though his voice remained controlled. "You could have corrected the story." "Yes. You have proof. Letters. Enough to ruin him. Then why did you not use them?" Cecily looked toward the crowded room. Lydia was not present, but the thought of her sister made the answer painful all over again. "My younger sister is quietly attached to Edmund's younger brother. Nothing has been announced. Their future depends upon both families remaining at peace. If I expose Edmund publicly, the quarrel will not remain between him and me. It will consume all of us. Lydia may lose the only man she has ever loved." Julian was silent. Cecily had expected disapproval. Perhaps even contempt. Men often praised sacrifice in women until the sacrifice became inconvenient. Instead he asked, "Does Lydia know what you surrendered for her?" "No, does Edmund. He suspects why I remained silent." "Then he has used your love for your sister as a weapon." The accuracy of it made Cecily look away. Julian's voice softened, but not enough to spare her from the truth. "You protected Lydia by giving Carlisle possession of your name. I protected her happiness." "Perhaps. But you speak as though those were the only choices." "They were the only choices that did not risk her future." "No," Julian said quietly. "They were the only choices you believed you were permitted to make." Cecily turned back sharply. He did not look triumphant. He did not look as though he had solved her life in a single conversation. He looked troubled on her behalf. "I do not mock what you did," he continued. "You accepted humiliation because you loved someone more than you loved being vindicated. That is not weakness. But sacrifice becomes dangerous when everyone begins expecting it from the same person." Cecily had never heard her decision described that way. Society called her cruel. Edmund called her unstable. Lydia, unaware of the truth, believed Cecily merely wished to forget the matter. Julian alone saw both the courage and the cost. "You make it sound foolish," she whispered. "No. I make it sound lonely." For one suspended moment, the crowded drawing room seemed to fall away. Cecily did not feel examined. She did not feel measured against Edmund's story. She felt seen. That frightened her more than ridicule would have. So she asked the question that had begun growing since the dinner table. "Why did you help me?" Julian looked toward the couples gathering near the center of the room. "You already know why." "Because I appeared cornered. That was why I began." "And why are you still doing it?" He was silent long enough for her to wonder whether he would answer. Then he said, "Because every woman introduced to me for the past 10 years has arrived with a list of advantages. Family connections. Estates. Expectations. They speak to my title as though the man carrying it is an administrative inconvenience." His gaze remained fixed ahead. "My parents married for precisely those reasons. position, property, duty. They spent 30 years in the same house and scarcely spoke unless a servant was present. Their marriage was praised as respectable. It was also a prison polished until no one outside could see the bars. Cecily heard the bitterness beneath his restraint. It had been planted there long ago. So you decided never to marry. I decided never to enter a negotiation disguised as affection. And yet tonight you became engaged to a stranger. He glanced at her. For 2 hours. It seemed a manageable commitment. Cecily smiled despite herself. You are very brave within strict limits. I have always thought so. The honesty between them became easier because it carried no promise. By midnight, the engagement would end. Neither could demand anything afterward. Inside that certainty, they could speak without performance. Cecily confessed that she dreaded entering rooms before anyone had said a word. Julian admitted he often left gatherings early because silence was preferable to being discussed as a prize. She said society saw his reserve as arrogance. He said society saw her composure as guilt. Both had been turned into characters by people who preferred easy stories. And for the first time that evening, neither of them had to act like the person the room expected. Edmund approached while Julian was briefly drawn aside by the Duchess, who wished to discuss the supposed announcement. Cecily remained near the window, watching Julian answer with careful ambiguity. She did not see Edmund until he stood beside her. "This is ambitious, even for you," he said softly. His public smile remained in place. "I do not know what you mean." "A duke, Cecily? You might at least have chosen someone likely to believe you." Her pulse quickened, but she refused to move away. "You appear troubled by my happiness." "I am troubled by his ignorance." Edmund leaned closer, keeping his voice beneath the music. "Has he heard what people say? Does he know how suddenly your affections change? Does he know what you did to me?" Cecily felt 6 months of humiliation pressing down at once. Edmund saw it and continued. "Enjoy the evening. By tomorrow, he will have spoken to someone. By tomorrow night, he will understand exactly what sort of woman he has attached himself to." The old fear returned because Edmund's power had never rested only in lies. It rested in repetition. Julian might believe her now, in the strange protection of this room, but what would happen after others warned him? What would happen when the engagement ended and he was free to reconsider? Edmund's smile sharpened. "Men like Arden do not choose women like you once they know the history." "How fortunate," Julian said from just behind him, "that I prefer forming my own judgments." Edmund turned. Julian's face was calm, but the room around them had grown quieter. Several guests had noticed his return. "Your Grace," Edmund began, "I intended only to prevent an unfortunate misunderstanding." "Then you have failed," Julian replied. He stepped to Cecily's side and offered her his arm. She placed her hand upon it, though she could feel the tension beneath his sleeve. Edmund tried again. "Surely you would wish to know why Lady Cecily's previous attachment ended." Julian looked first at Cecily, not Edmund. That choice was visible to everyone. "Lady Cecily has told me what she believes I ought to know." It was not entirely true, yet it protected her without speaking for her. Edmund's face tightened. "And you accept her account without question?" Julian's answer carried clearly across the nearest part of the room. "I accept her character." Silence followed. It was the kind of silence that changed reputations. Julian continued, almost pleasantly, "You seem remarkably concerned that I should distrust the lady I intend to marry. A less generous man might wonder why." The attention of the room shifted fully toward Edmund. His wounded dignity suddenly looked less dignified. His concern looked possessive. His questions looked petty. For the first time, he was the one forced to feel every eye upon him. I meant no insult, he said stiffly. Then none need be remembered, Julian replied. It was dismissal delivered without cruelty and made more devastating by restraint. Edmund bowed and withdrew. Conversation resumed slowly, but the balance had changed. Cecily looked up at Julian. You said you accepted my character. I do. You have known me for scarcely 2 hours. I have known many people for years who have revealed less. The answer left her without breath. Around them, society continued celebrating an engagement that did not exist. Yet beneath the questions, invented memories, and carefully staged affection, something real had begun. Cecily had entered the evening needing only a shield from humiliation. Julian had agreed because he recognized a cornered stranger. Neither had expected the lie to become the first place in years where they could tell the truth. The orchestra had scarcely finished tuning before the Duchess of Blackthorn rose from her chair with unmistakable satisfaction shining across her face. My friends, she announced, it would be an unforgivable discourtesy to allow such wonderful news to pass without celebration. Since we have unexpectedly gained an engaged couple this evening, I insist that His Grace and Lady Cecily open the first dance. Applause answered her before either of them could object. Several ladies smiled with open delight while gentlemen stepped aside to clear the polished floor. The musicians immediately lifted their bows, grateful for instruction. Cecily felt the blood drain from her face. Dancing together was one thing. Opening the evening as the honored couple was another entirely. It transformed an impulsive deception into a public declaration witnessed by half of London's most influential families. Worse still, the Duchess was already speaking enthusiastically to 2 matrons about arranging a formal announcement before the season ended. We simply must host another dinner, she said. A duke's engagement deserves proper celebration. Cecily's heart sank. This was no longer a lie that would vanish with dessert. It threatened to become a rumor carried into every drawing room in Mayfair by breakfast. She turned quickly toward Julian, lowering her voice before anyone noticed her expression. This has gone too far. He regarded her calmly. It has become complicated. No, she whispered. It has become dangerous. Your reputation will suffer because of me. Around them, guests continued smiling, utterly convinced they were witnessing 2 shy lovers embarrassed by unexpected attention. You must end it before the dance begins. Julian remained perfectly still. Not while Carlyle is watching. He will watch regardless. Precisely. His eyes drifted briefly across the room, where Edmund stood rigid beside the fireplace, unable to conceal the frustration hardening his face. If I step away now, Julian continued quietly, everyone will conclude he has been correct about you from the beginning. Cecily looked down. They will conclude I deceived a duke. No, his answer came with quiet certainty. They will conclude that a frightened woman reached for help, and the gentleman she trusted abandoned her in public. She swallowed hard. You owe me nothing. At this moment, Julian replied, offering his arm as the orchestra struck its opening notes, I owe you exactly 1 dance. The remark should have sounded light. Instead it carried the strained steadiness that had marked every decision he made that evening. Cecily placed her hand upon his sleeve because there was no graceful escape left. As they stepped onto the center of the floor, conversation softened into eager whispers. Every eye followed them. Edmund watched without blinking. The Duchess smiled as though witnessing the happiest surprise of the season. Cecily wondered whether she had just destroyed the future of the one gentleman kind enough to rescue her. The first notes of the waltz echoed gently through the drawing room as Julian guided Cecily into position. His hand settled respectfully at her back, careful enough to honor every convention, yet close enough that she could feel the reassuring steadiness of his breathing. The room disappeared almost immediately. Not because the guests had stopped watching, but because Julian seemed entirely unconcerned by them. "Do not look toward Carlyle," he said quietly as they began to move. "Look only at me." That seems an impossible instruction. It is considerably easier than worrying about 50 opinions at once. She almost smiled. "You make impossible things sound ordinary. Only because panic makes ordinary things impossible." They turned gracefully across the polished floor. Cecily had expected awkwardness. Instead, Julian danced with calm precision, adjusting each movement to match hers rather than expecting her to follow him blindly. It felt less like being led than being understood. The realization unsettled her more than she wished to admit. "May I ask you something?" she murmured after several moments. "You already have." "A serious question. Those are generally more interesting." She hesitated. "Why did you truly believe me?" Julian considered the question longer than she expected. "Because you did not ask me to rescue you." She frowned slightly. "You asked me to pretend," he continued. "There is a difference." She searched his expression. "I do not understand." People invent stories to gain advantage every day. They flatter. They manipulate. They perform. His gaze remained steady upon hers. "You did none of those things. You looked like someone trying to survive the next 10 minutes. Cecily lowered her eyes. "I expected you to laugh." "Why?" "Because everyone else eventually does." The words escaped before she could stop them. "Or they pity me. Or they quietly excuse themselves." I had prepared for every possible humiliation except kindness. Julian's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "When you sat beside me," he said, "I recognized something familiar." "What?" "The expression of a person cornered by a story she no longer controls." She looked back at him in surprise. "I have seen that look before." His voice remained low enough that only she could hear. "Not upon myself. Upon my mother." The admission carried unexpected weight. "My father valued appearances above peace. Every dinner, every portrait, every conversation had to present the illusion of a perfect household. The truth mattered far less than the version repeated often enough." He guided her through another turn before continuing. "My mother spent years trapped inside a reputation she had never chosen. By the time anyone asked whether she was happy, they had already decided the answer for her." Cecily listened without interrupting. "When you took my hand tonight," Julian said quietly, "I saw that same expression. Not fear of discovery." He paused. Fear of being judged before anyone bothered asking what happened. For several moments neither of them spoke. The orchestra carried them gently around the room while applause occasionally followed particularly elegant couples joining the dance. Yet Cecily noticed none of it. Something inside her carefully defended heart had begun to shift. Not toward love. That would have been absurd after a single evening. But toward trust. Trust frightened her more because it demanded hope, and hope had cost her dearly once already. She forced herself to remember that midnight would end everything. 2 hours. That had always been the agreement. Anything beyond that belonged only to imagination. The music ended beneath generous applause, but the evening refused to release them. Before Cecily and Julian could leave the floor, another stir swept through the drawing room as the butler announced a late arrival. Lady Lydia Norwood. Cecily froze. Her younger sister hurried inside, cheeks flushed from the delay, apologizing warmly to the Duchess before finally lifting her eyes toward the gathering. Her gaze landed immediately upon Cecily standing beside Julian. Then she heard someone say the words "their engagement," and the color drained from her face. Cecily's heart lurched. Lydia knew nothing of the deception. One startled question. One innocent denial. That was all it would take. Lydia crossed the room quickly. Cecily, she began before stopping herself. Her eyes moved from Julian's composed expression to Edmund standing several yards away. She noticed the bitterness in his face. She noticed the unusual confidence returning to her sister's posture after months of quiet humiliation. Most importantly, she noticed that Edmund looked frightened for the first time since winter. Lydia had always been observant. The realization appeared slowly behind her eyes. "I had not realized congratulations were in order," she said carefully. Julian bowed with effortless courtesy. "Lady Lydia." She returned the greeting, then looked at Cecily with a question that needed no words. "Are you protecting me again?" Cecily could answer only with the smallest movement of her eyes. Lydia understood. Pain flickered briefly across her face before disappearing beneath composure. "I hope," she said warmly enough for nearby guests to hear, "that His Grace appreciates how stubborn my sister can be." Julian answered without hesitation. "I have already begun discovering it." Several ladies laughed. The moment passed. Lydia had saved the deception. Yet once they found themselves briefly alone near the conservatory doors, she caught Cecily's hands tightly. "What have you done?" she whispered. "Exactly enough to survive tonight. This is not real." No, Lydia looked toward Edmund again. "Then why is he so angry?" Cecily said nothing. She no longer needed to. Lydia's expression slowly changed from confusion to heartbreak. "You never defended yourself," she murmured. "Because of Charles." Cecily looked away. "You knew." "Not until this moment." Lydia's voice trembled. "I kept wondering why you accepted such cruelty." Before Cecily could answer, the sisters were interrupted by approaching guests eager to congratulate them again. Lydia recovered first. She smiled, praised the supposed engagement, and even remarked that she had suspected something for weeks. The lie survived because Lydia chose to protect it. But as she stepped away, she glanced once toward Charles Carlyle speaking with another gentleman across the room. For the first time, uncertainty crossed her face. She had believed her happiness required Cecily's silence. Now she was no longer certain that any future built upon such sacrifice deserved to survive. Meanwhile, Edmund had reached the end of his patience. He approached Julian before several influential gentlemen, smiling with practiced courtesy. "Your Grace," he said pleasantly, "forgive my persistence. Since you and Lady Cecily are now to be married, I imagine you have discussed the conclusion of her previous attachment." The surrounding conversation quieted immediately. Cecily felt her stomach tighten. Here it was. The public humiliation she had dreaded all evening. Edmund continued before Julian could answer. After all, any gentleman would naturally wish to understand why his fiancée abandoned another courtship so unexpectedly. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. No one interrupted. They wanted the answer. Julian regarded Edmund steadily. "I know enough." Edmund smiled. "Enough?" "Enough to trust Lady Cecily's character more than I trust rumors repeated by those who benefit from them." The word settled over the room. Like absolute silence. Edmund's expression hardened. "Surely that is rather generous." No, Julian's voice remained calm. "It is simply easier than believing that a gentleman wronged by a lady would spend 6 months ensuring every drawing room heard only his version." A murmur spread through the nearby guests. Edmund answered too quickly. "I never visited every drawing room." Then he stopped. Several people looked at him curiously. Lady Ashcombe frowned. "Lord Edmund," she said thoughtfully, "I distinctly recall hearing the story from you at Lord Pembroke's musicale in February." Another gentleman nodded. "And I first heard it from you at White's." Edmund realized too late what he had revealed. He had insisted for months that society had simply misunderstood events. Yet now he had denied something no one had accused him of, exposing how actively he had managed the story himself. Tiny contradictions began surfacing around the room. "I thought you said she rejected you after Easter," someone remarked. "No," another answered. "He told us it was January. Wasn't the engagement nearly announced?" "I never heard that." Edmund attempted to recover, but every explanation produced another inconsistency. For the first time since the scandal began, people were examining his account instead of repeating it. Cecily watched in astonishment. Julian had not exposed Edmund. He had merely invited everyone else to think. That proved infinitely more devastating. As the evening slowly approached its close, the atmosphere within the drawing room had shifted in subtle but unmistakable ways. Guests still congratulated Cecily and Julian, yet their conversations now carried thoughtful pauses whenever Edmund's name arose. Doubt had entered the room, and doubt once planted was difficult to remove. Cecily should have felt relieved. Instead, she found herself increasingly unsettled by something far more dangerous than society's changing opinion. Julian believed her. Not because the deception required it. Not because it served his reputation. He believed her after hearing the truth, weighing it quietly, and choosing his own judgment. That choice frightened her because it awakened a longing she had forbidden herself 6 months earlier, the hope that someone might know everything and remain. She had promised herself never again to mistake kindness for permanence. Yet Julian's every action challenged that promise. While guests collected cloaks and prepared carriages, Lydia found Cecily one final time in the corridor outside the drawing room. No curious ears remained nearby. "Listen to me carefully," Lydia said, taking both of her sister's hands. "If you have remained silent because of Charles and me," Cecily tried to interrupt. Lydia shook her head. "No. Let me finish." Tears gathered in her eyes. "I would rather lose every hope I have than keep it by sacrificing you." Cecily stared at her. "You do not mean that." "I do." Lydia's voice grew steadier. "If Charles is honorable, the truth will not drive him away. If it does," she swallowed painfully, "then he was never worth what you surrendered." The word struck Cecily harder than anything Edmund had ever said. For 6 months she had believed silence was the price of her sister's future. Now Lydia herself was removing that burden. "You may tell the truth," she whispered. "Not because I wish for revenge. Because I cannot bear watching you disappear any longer." Before Cecily could answer, Lydia embraced her tightly. When they parted, Julian was waiting respectfully several steps away, giving them privacy without pretending not to notice. Cecily looked from her sister to the Duke. The evening had begun with desperation and a lie whispered beneath a dining table. It was ending with something she had never expected to recover, the freedom to reclaim her own voice. She had only asked Julian Arden to be her fiancé for 2 hours. Without either of them realizing it, those 2 hours had already begun changing both of their lives. The final guests had begun calling for their carriages when Cecily found Julian standing alone beside the tall windows overlooking the moonlit gardens. The orchestra had fallen silent. Servants moved discreetly through the drawing room collecting empty glasses while conversation softened into farewells. The excitement surrounding the supposed engagement had become the evening's favorite story, and Cecily knew every household represented in the room would carry it home before sunrise. She drew a careful breath. "Your Grace." He turned immediately. "Lady Cecily." She managed a faint smile. "Our 2 hours have ended." For the first time since she had sat beside him at dinner, neither of them spoke for several moments. Then Cecily continued quietly. "Thank you for giving me back my dignity tonight. I shall never forget your kindness." She lowered her eyes. "But I cannot allow this rumor to follow you beyond this house." Tomorrow I will explain everything. I involved you without permission, and I have no wish to damage your name further." She expected relief. Perhaps even agreement. Instead, Julian studied her with the same thoughtful calm that had unsettled her all evening. "May I ask one question before you sacrifice yourself again?" She looked up. "Is ending this engagement what you genuinely want?" She hesitated. "Or," he continued gently, "is it simply the next duty you have assigned yourself because protecting everyone else has become easier than considering your own happiness?" The word struck with uncomfortable precision. Cecily opened her mouth, but no answer came. She had spent 6 months choosing duty over herself until the difference between desire and obligation had almost disappeared. Before she could search for the truth, another voice interrupted behind them. "How touching!" Edmund Carlyle stepped into the open space between departing guests, his expression composed enough to invite attention. Several nearby conversations quieted instinctively. "Forgive me," he said smoothly, "but before this remarkable engagement becomes tomorrow's greatest triumph, should not His Grace know that Lady Cecily has deceived another gentleman before?" Every face turned toward them. The room settled into expectant silence. Edmund bowed slightly toward Julian. "She encouraged my affections, accepted my devotion, then discarded me without explanation. If she has now misled a duke as thoroughly as she misled me, surely the truth deserves daylight." Cecily felt the familiar weight of humiliation rising again, but something had changed. Across the room Lydia stood watching with quiet determination. Their eyes met. Lydia gave one unmistakable nod. "Tell the truth." At last, the burden she had carried alone no longer belonged only to her. Cecily stepped forward before Julian could answer. Her voice remained steady despite the dozens of eyes fixed upon her. "Very well," she said. "Let us have the truth." Edmund's confident smile faltered almost imperceptibly. "Lord Edmund courted me while knowing I would soon receive control of my inheritance upon my 25th birthday. During that same courtship, he secretly pursued another lady whose fortune exceeded mine." A ripple of surprise moved through the guests. Cecily continued before anyone could interrupt. "I discovered his deception myself. I ended our understanding immediately. I believed the matter finished. Instead, Lord Edmund hurried to every drawing room willing to receive him and announced that I had behaved irrationally after he rejected me." Edmund laughed softly. "An imaginative account." Cecily met his gaze without flinching. "You know it is true." She looked toward the assembled guests. "I remained silent because my younger sister had formed an attachment to Lord Edmund's younger brother. Exposing him publicly would have ignited a feud between our families and endangered her future." Several ladies glanced toward Lydia with growing sympathy. "So I accepted becoming the villain," Cecily said. "Not because I lacked the truth. Because I believed my sister's happiness mattered more than my reputation." She drew a slow breath. "That decision was mine. The lies that followed were not." Edmund attempted to interrupt. "Convenient." "No," Cecily answered firmly. "Necessary." He turned toward the guests with practiced indignation. "Does anyone truly believe I spent months inventing such a story?" Julian remained silent exactly as he had promised, allowing Cecily's voice to stand alone. She reached calmly into her reticule and withdrew several folded letters. "You asked whether anyone believes it." She held the letters where the nearest guests could see them. "These are notes Lord Edmund wrote arranging meetings with the second lady while assuring me his affections belonged solely to me. I never used them because I hoped silence would spare my sister." She lowered the letters again. "Tonight she released me from that promise." Lydia stepped forward. "She speaks the truth. If my future depends upon my sister remaining dishonoured, then it is not a future I wish to keep." A hush settled over the room. The injustice Cecily had endured suddenly possessed shape, motive, and cost. It was no longer gossip. It was sacrifice. Only after Cecily finished did Julian speak. His voice remained measured, carrying easily across the silent drawing room. I cannot testify regarding events before this evening. He looked first at Cecily rather than Edmund. But I can testify to what I have witnessed tonight. He turned calmly toward the guests. Lord Edmund has spent hours attempting to persuade me against trusting Lady Cecily. He has questioned her repeatedly in public, interrupted private conversations, and shown extraordinary concern that I should adopt his opinion instead of forming my own. Julian's gaze rested briefly upon Edmund. That is not the conduct of a gentleman peacefully wronged. It is the conduct of a man determined to preserve control of a story. No one answered. They scarcely needed to. Edmund's own behavior throughout the evening had become impossible to ignore. Then another voice entered unexpectedly. Charles Carlyle crossed the room and stopped beside Lydia. His face carried unmistakable disappointment. "Cousin," he said quietly to Edmund, "if Lady Cecily has remained silent these many months believing she protected my happiness, then I owe her an apology rather than suspicion." Edmund stared at him. "You cannot be serious." "Entirely." Charles looked toward Lydia with open sincerity. No honorable relationship asks one woman to surrender her good name so another may marry in comfort. Lydia's eyes filled with tears. "You believe us?" "I believe what I have witnessed." Charles faced the assembled guests. "And I know my brother well enough to recognize ambition when it wears courtesy." The last support beneath Edmund's carefully constructed reputation disappeared. Lady Ashcombe quietly accepted the letters Cecily offered and glanced through the first page before closing it with visible disappointment. Other gentlemen began recalling contradictions from earlier conversations. Ladies exchanged thoughtful looks instead of sympathetic sighs. Edmund attempted another explanation, but each sentence only deepened the silence around him. The room that had once repeated his version without question now regarded him with growing distance. His humiliation came not from shouted accusations but from the absence of belief. Cecily watched it happen without satisfaction. She felt only relief. For the first time in 6 months she no longer carried someone else's lie upon her shoulders. She had reclaimed her own story. No title had rescued her. No dramatic speech had spoken for her. Julian had waited until she finished, then simply trusted what she had already proven. Guests departed gradually after that, leaving behind only quiet conversations and scattered candlelight. The Duchess apologized warmly to Cecily for believing false reports, while others followed with embarrassed kindness. Eventually the drawing room emptied until only Cecily and Julian remained near the entrance hall. She turned toward him with a grateful smile. "Now I truly must release you from this engagement." Julian shook his head gently. "You are determined to dismiss me." "I cannot ask more." "You have not asked." He smiled faintly. "Allow me, for once." Cecily waited. "I shall not propose tonight," he said. "You deserve better than a decision made before an audience still discussing scandal." She looked surprised. "Then what are you asking?" "Permission to court you honestly after tonight." The simplicity of the request left her unexpectedly speechless. Julian continued. "For 2 hours we invented where we met, how we laughed together, and how long we had cared for one another. I wish to discard every invented part. And keep what," she whispered. "The truths we told accidentally." Cecily searched his face carefully. "How do I know this is not sympathy?" "Because sympathy would have ended when Carlyle stopped threatening you." "Or excitement?" "Excitement fades before midnight." He met her eyes steadily. "My interest has not." Months passed before either mentioned marriage. Julian visited without grand gestures. He learned Cecily beyond crisis, discovering her sharp humor, stubborn independence, and quiet habit of placing everyone else first. Cecily learned that accepting affection did not require surrendering herself, and that Julian's reserve concealed warmth rather than distance. Society gradually forgot the scandal and remembered instead the gentleman who had believed before believing became fashionable. When they finally married, the Duchess of Blackthorn laughingly claimed responsibility for introducing them, though everyone present knew the truth had begun beneath a dinner table. Late during the wedding breakfast, Julian leaned closer and asked softly, "Do you remember declaring us engaged without my permission?" Cecily laughed. "I only needed you for 2 hours." He took her hand exactly as he had that first impossible evening. 2 hours, he replied, were enough to make me want the rest of my life. They smiled together as family gathered close around them.